Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for this session, Catalysts for Climate Action, Leveraging the Power of Young People to Move the Catholic Church on Climate. My name is Anna Robertson, and I am Director of Youth and Young Adult Mobilization at Catholic Climate Covenant. And I am presenting today alongside my colleague, Dr. Dan DiLeo. So why don't you come off mute and introduce yourself, Dan?
Yes, I'm Dan DiLeo. I'm a Catholic theologian at Creighton University in Omaha, Nebraska, and I'm also a consultant with Catholic Climate Covenant.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So today we're going to be talking about the power of young people to activate the U.S. Catholic Church's response to climate change, specifically and the ecological crises more broadly. So I'm going to borrow the words of Cardinal Blase Cupich of Chicago to illustrate our hypothesis. You have much more power than you think, young people. So Cardinal Cupich offered this remark during the Q&A following his keynote presentation at this past summer's virtual Laudato Si in the U.S. Catholic Church Conference, which was co-sponsored by Catholic Climate Covenant and Creighton University. And in the larger context of the quote, which you can see here, Cardinal Cupich encouraged young people to seek out dialogue with church leaders about the climate crisis. And one of my favorite things about his words of encouragement is that he specifically calls on young people who've been less engaged in parish life. So how many of you listening right now might think to yourself, gosh, I've hardly been to Mass since before the pandemic, so no one would listen to me, better leave it to someone who's more involved. I hear you, and I've been there, but one of the things that we want you to walk away with today is the confidence that regardless of how active you've been in more traditional forms of engagement with Catholicism, you have the power to transform hearts and to inspire action within the U.S. Catholic Church for care of creation and for its most vulnerable members. And you already have your most powerful tool in your tool belt, your story. So in our time together, we will lay the groundwork for you to understand not only why, as a young person or a person who supports young people, you have immense power to activate the U.S. Catholic Church on climate, but also why an activated U.S. Catholic Church has the potential to be such a key player in the global fight for a habitable and thriving future for all. And we'll explore the spiritual and theological grounding of advocacy, so the why, as well as some of the more practical and strategic angles of advocacy, the how. And we'll talk about how you can level up your climate storytelling skills and offer some additional tools for advocacy for you to add to your tool belt. So before I hand off the mic to Dan, I want to share one more quote. This one's from Cardinal Jean-Claude Hollerich on a webinar with Laudato Si movement earlier this year. Like Cardinal Cupich, Cardinal Hollerich is explicitly encouraging young people to approach church leaders with their concerns about climate, in this case, specifically relating to fossil fuel divestment. He says, quote, "Bishops normally are not young people, but we're like grandfathers, and grandfathers normally listen to their granddaughters and grandsons. They have a very close relation to their granddaughters and grandsons. So please, young people, tell your grandfather bishops about fossil fuel disinvestment." So there you have it, friends. The invitation is loud and clear. So Dan, I'm a Catholic young adult. Maybe I go to church every once in a while. Maybe I'm there every weekend. Maybe I haven't been since I left home for college. Why should I spend my precious time and energy advocating to church leaders about climate change? How much power does the Catholic Church really have to affect change on this issue?
Well, Catholic Church has a lot of power. And I think before we talk about that, I want to just flag why it is that the church sees leveraging this power as essential to its mission. I think most people on this webinar probably know that really since Pope Francis's encyclical in 2015, the Catholic Church sees climate change as a global problem with grave implications, environmental, social, economic, political, and for the distribution of goods. It represents one of the principal challenges facing humanity in our day. And this is nothing new for the Catholic Church. John Paul II in 1990 talked about climate change as a moral issue. So this has been part of Catholic teaching for a long time. And there are several reasons for why this is. Part of it is because climate change is a justice issue. You can see here the world distributed according to historic carbon pollution from the Industrial Revolution. You can see that the wealthiest places in the world, especially the United States, are most responsible for causing climate change. So this is a justice issue. This is an issue that increasingly is going to impact human flourishing, availability and access to things like food and water as droughts begin to become more frequent and severe. Climate change threatens security. This is an insight from the US Department of Defense, that climate change is a threat multiplier. It threatens destabilization when people begin to struggle for increasingly scarce resources, or people are displaced and they have to forcibly be relocated, sometimes into places that don't really want to receive them. Climate change threatens the flourishing of persons, but also communities. So this is a projection that rising sea levels alone could displace 2 billion people by the year 2100. Climate change is a life issue. People are dependent upon our natural world for flourishing, but for life itself. The projections of human fatalities associated with climate change are mind-boggling, to say the least. And it's an issue because the choices we make now will impact our future. So this is a graph from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that plots potential warming scenarios up to the end of the century. Based on the choices we make now, we might limit warming to 1.5, maybe 2 degrees. Warming could also go up to 3, 4, and maybe even 5 degrees, which might not sound like a lot, but is the difference between a relatively stable world and one that in many ways doesn't resemble the one that we have now, in terms of coastlines and resources and wildfires and all of those different things. So this is very much a moral issue for the Catholic Church that's essential to its mission. And the Catholic Church has extraordinary potential to address this issue. We've got so many resources that could be put at the disposal of society's efforts to address climate change. We've got theology, we've got ecclesiology and missiology, so ways of understanding the church and its mission, and ethics that help us to frame climate change as a moral issue. We've got an institutional structure. We've got 17,000 parishes across 178 dioceses across the country. So we have an extraordinary network that's already in place. We've got leadership in place. We've got over 400 active and retired bishops. We've got 35,000 priests and 18,000 deacons. So we've got people scattered across the country. We've got money. The US Catholic Church has billions of US dollars in endowments and investments, dollars that could be withdrawn from fossil fuel corporations and reinvested in renewable energy initiatives. We've got advocacy structures. We've got nationally the US Conference of Catholic Bishops, but we've also got state Catholic conferences. 48 different states have state level advocacy networks that do state level advocacy. And we've also got NGOs like ISN. So this is an incredible resource. We've got healthcare facilities, 500 hospitals across the country. Hospitals and healthcare facilities are the second highest consumer of energy in the United States. So we've got institutions that consume, but also could decrease the amount of energy and the kinds of energy they take. We've got infrastructure. We've got over 100,000 buildings in the US between parishes, dioceses, rectories, schools. We've got buildings that, again, consume energy and could consume less or more renewable energy. We've got land. We've literally got millions of acres, retreat houses, college campuses, cemeteries that could site renewable energy. They could site solar, they could site wind. And most importantly, we've got people power. We've got more than 70 million US Catholics. And this is where youth and young adults come in. We've got about 20 million US Catholics under the age of 18 and about 11.5 million Catholics between the ages of 23 and 38 years old. We've got people. We've got lots and lots of people. And we've got people, again, who are organized in identifiable structures. We've got US Catholic Church has almost 5,000 elementary schools that educate over 1 million students every year. We've got 1,200 secondary schools educating 500,000 students, and we've got 225 colleges and universities that educate 750,000 students every year. So climate change is a moral issue for the Catholic Church, and it's one that we have extraordinary potential to address if we decided to put the full force and weight of our networks and resources behind the effort to address the issue. So a lot of responsibility, but a lot of opportunity.
Thank you so much, Dan. I'm sold for one. But what about this other piece, this question of young people in the church? So remember what Cardinal Cupich said, you have more power than you think, young people. So was he right? And if so, why? So during a prayer vigil at World Youth Day in Rio de Janeiro in 2013, Pope Francis proclaimed to the young people in the attendance, your young hearts want to build a better world. It's the young who want to be the protagonists of change. Please don't leave it to others to be the protagonists of change. You are the ones who hold the future. I ask you to be protagonists of this transformation. I wonder for those young people in attendance, how this quote lands for you. Are you inspired and energized? Do you find the charge perhaps a bit overwhelming? We're all in our own ways called to be protagonists of transformation. And this is a really empowering vocation at the end of the day. As Saint Teresa of Avila put it, Christ has no body now but yours, no hands, no feet on earth but yours. We're called to be radical agents of transformational love in the world. And yet I've heard from many of the young people that I accompany in my work at the Covenant, a sense of exasperation after so many years of hearing from older generations, you are my hope for the future. A future which year after year looks increasingly bleak. A sentiment that's meant to be empowering can land as burdensome in the face of obstacles that can seem insurmountable. So speaking as a young person myself, many of us long to be active agents in our communities and in history, embraced and celebrated for our gifts, but we don't want to do it alone. So as findings from the Springtide Research Institute show, young people thrive when they have supportive mentors in their life. So as I'm sharing these statistics, if you're a young person, I wonder how it resonates with you. Just pay attention. Is this true for me? So 24% of survey respondents who reported having no mentor relationships with adults also reported never having a sense of meaning and purpose in their lives. And when respondents have just one mentor in their life, that number drops to 6%. Supportive intergenerational relationships are important for young people's thriving. When we listen to young people benefit. That seems like a no-brainer. And yet, whereas historically, young people may have sought out mentorship within institutions like the church, today that's less the case. So when surveyed about what adults young people could turn to for support, only 8% of respondents identified religious leaders. So this is something those of us who work with young people who are here need to pay attention to. Meanwhile, organized religion across the board is seeing a drop in membership among young people, and this is a trend known as disaffiliation. So in this breakdown of data from the General Social Survey between 1975 and 2020, we see the rising number of people who identify as having no religion, broken down by age. And so it might be kind of hard to see those numbers, but the top line is 18 to 34, and the bottom line is 65 plus. So though the numbers are increasing of people who identify as having no religion across the age ranges, we see that they're highest among people aged 18 to 34, with over 30% identifying as having no religion in 2020, compared with just over 10% in 1975. So this is a trend that's reflected in our Catholic parishes and organizations. Among the most common questions that I hear in my job is, how do we get more young people involved in our Creation Care initiative? And I would say that I hear it at least once a week. And I'm guessing there are some of you who are here today because you're interested in finding answers to that question, and it's a good one. So we could have an entirely separate presentation just about that question. But what I want to highlight right now, especially for the young people who are present, is that right now people are listening. If climate change and the ecological crises are important to us, we have an opportunity to speak up and to be heard. And that doesn't mean that it'll be easy or that everyone will be receptive to what we have to say. Social change, kingdom building, it's never easy, but we can learn from generations of community organizers and change makers how to see the opportunities and closed doors, how to grow and shape power, how to harness the power of story to transform hearts and lives. So up next, Dan is going to spend some time establishing some Catholic theological grounding for advocacy, the why. And as he talks, I want to offer you two questions to pay attention to. So first, how might this information equip me to advocate effectively with church leaders on climate change and ecological justice? So as you're listening and you're thinking, what if I approached my priest or my principal, or this is true in the political sphere too. Maybe you're talking to a politician who shares your faith. How might this information equip you to do that effectively? And second, what's my why? So why am I committed to combating the climate and ecological crises? So we'll leave you with those two questions to think about as I turn the mic over to Dan.
Well, thanks, Anna. And I want to emphasize that in my experience working with students, college students, especially here at Creighton, I think this next set of material has been some of the most helpful because it provides kind of a foundation on which people can ground their faith-based advocacy. That if you can clearly show how advocacy for climate justice isn't an optional add-on, but that it's essential to the fullness of faith. I think that's been most compelling in terms of being able to change minds and hearts, especially of people in power who are able to change some of the policies. So I want to walk through just in very brief terms, ecclesiology and missiology. So ecclesiology is the study of the church, and missiology is the study of the church's mission. And this might be a little bit of a heavy lift, but hopefully you can appreciate the payoff for what all of this background is going to get us and leave us with. In the Catholic tradition, the church is basically and fundamentally understood as the people of God, all the baptized. Before it's an institution, a building, a magisterium, the church is all people. The law of the church is love. And I should clarify, these documents are from the Second Vatican Council, so these are coming from Lumen Gentium. Its law is the new commandment to love as Christ loved us. And in the Catholic tradition, love, from Thomas Aquinas especially, is both willing, but also acting for the good. Love is willing and acting. Love is a verb. And when we think about love, in many ways, we're talking about justice. The idea of biblical justice, justice as it appears in the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament, is always framed in terms of fidelity to the demands of a relationship. It's always essentially framed in terms of love. So when we think about the mission of the church, we can really think about it as synonymously justice and love. And this is, in fact, what the Second Vatican Council affirmed. The church's mission is to advance God's kingdom, and this kingdom is defined as one of truth and life, of holiness and grace, of justice, love, and peace. That's why the church exists, to build and advance this kind of world. And how does it do that? How does the church do that? It does it through evangelization. The proper purpose of the church's mission is evangelization. And for me, this term is something I grew up with, but never fully, I think, really appreciated. As a cradle Catholic, I heard evangelization, and for me, it was always kind of speaking, right? I'm going to tell people about Jesus. In the Catholic tradition, that's not wrong, but that's not sufficient. Because evangelization, as Second Vatican Council describes, is the announcing of Christ by a living testimony, as well as by the spoken word. Evangelization requires action, because love requires action. So putting all these pieces together, understanding the church and justice and love and the church's mission, justice and work for justice is essential to the mission of the church. And this was articulated in 1971 by the World Synod of Bishops in the document Justitia in Mundo. Action on behalf of justice and participation in the transformation of the world fully appear to us as a constitutive dimension of the preaching of the gospel, or in other words, of the church's mission. Work for justice is essential to the church's mission. It's not an optional or a secondary add-on. And for those of you familiar with Ignatian spirituality, this is what the Jesuits have expressed in slightly different language when we speak about faith that does justice. So this is from the Jesuits' GC 35 document, the service of faith and the promotion of justice indissolubly united remain at the heart of our mission. And hopefully you can appreciate this when we think about the full definition or understanding of faith in the Catholic tradition. It's the adequate response to God's love. It's a response that requires willing and acting. So the faith that does justice is love and action, which is something that goes back all the way into the depths of the tradition. For example, in chapter 2 of James, we see the affirmation that faith without works is dead. The fullness of faith requires action and work for justice. This is the fullness of Catholic faith. When we think about it in these terms, we can start to ask, well, what does this look like? How does the church begin to enact this love as essential to its mission? Here, this is a resource that hopefully you've seen at one point or another from the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops that talks about the 2 feet of love in action. Essentially, the Catholic tradition affirms the need for the green foot of charitable works. In willing and acting for the good of others, we have to work interpersonally, to encounter persons, to meet basic needs, to provide aid to individuals in current situations. That's necessary, but alone is insufficient, because in the Catholic tradition, love also requires social justice, which is working to reform systems and structures and policies that necessitate charitable works in the first place, right? It's one thing to go serve a meal to somebody experiencing homelessness. It's another thing to ask, why are they in this situation? Is there a system or a structure or a policy that might be changed to prevent their need in the future? And here we can start to talk about the connection in the Catholic tradition between social justice and politics. And here I think we need to define our terms, because politics is not necessarily what we always think of in terms of maybe public policy. Politics most basically comes from the Greek word polis for city, and it simply refers to how people organize and govern themselves as a group, right? It's all the processes, activities that structure life in a community. Debate, disagreement, argument, persuasion, that's politics. In the Catholic tradition, politics matters because people matter. Politics structures life in society, and those structures, for better or for worse, promote or undermine human flourishing. So if politics is a channel that enables us to love people, and loving people is essentially what the church is called to do, politics is essential to the mission of the church. And this is something that Pope Francis has emphasized more and more in his papacy. So in Laudato Si, we read that love overflowing with small gestures of mutual care is also civic and political. Love is political. And I think it's important here to emphasize that when we think about politics, politics can be thinking about advocating to shape policies that are external, right? Life in society, federal policy or state level policy, city level policy, but it can also be internal. Catholic advocacy can engage in politics to try and change and reform the internal structures or policies that structure the church as a community, as the people of God. So when we think about all of this, we put it together and we think about advocacy, right? And we think about advocacy both internal and external. And in the Catholic tradition, when we think about all of this, we can start to connect it to what Pope Francis has emphasized in terms of a culture of encounter. This has been one of the themes of his papacy. He articulated it most recently in Fratelli Tutti, and he talks about how to speak of a culture of encounter means that we as a people should be passionate about meeting others, seeking points of contact, building bridges, planning a project that includes everyone. So the culture of encounter is authentic relationship building. He says this is a key to love, ultimately. And interestingly, this has been affirmed by political science and the social sciences. So this is a graph from a book, Citizens Handbook to Influencing Elected Officials, that essentially polls congressional staffers. and asks, what's the most influential action a person or a group can take to influence an undecided legislator? And far and away, the most influential factor is constituent visits, one-on-one or group encounters where constituents actually go and meet with the elected official. And ISN does a tremendous job of this and helping young people get this experience. So it's great to send letters, it's great to make phone calls, but more than anything else, it's encounter that's the most effective type of advocacy. So we can think about this again in terms of the external church, but this insight about encounter-based advocacy also holds for advocacy within the church, encountering leaders to try and change minds and hearts. And this is really the pivot that Catholic Climate Covenant has undertaken most recently, trying to equip Catholics, especially young people, to encounter their Catholic leaders, to prioritize climate change and climate policy. So several weeks ago, we launched this resource, Encounter for Climate Action, Steps and Resources for Engaging Your Catholic Leader. And you can see the bit.ly link here at the top. But essentially what we did with this resource was to build on ISN's Advocacy 101 resource and to apply it more specifically to advocacy within the church and advocacy around climate change. And so the entire resource builds out all of these different structures, and some of this isn't super clear, at least on my screen, but in a sense, what we were trying to do with this resource was equip people with kind of a systematic step-by-step process to begin to encounter Catholic leaders, especially young people, to make that encounter. Looking at step 2, one of the most important things at the outset that people can do is to identify others. It's one thing for one person to meet with a leader. It's much more effective if you bring a group with you. And so our recommendation is for people to go and get 5 or 10 others to be able to meet with. In this case, this resource is intended to help people meet with their bishop. And this resource, I should say, is specifically focused on helping US Catholics around the climate action letter for Catholic institutions, which we can talk more about, but essentially is a sign-on letter for Catholic schools and parishes to support the COP26 UN climate negotiations that are happening November 1st through the 12th. So that's the context of this resource. The third step here is to invite others. So again, once you've identified who else you might bring into the fold, you have to take the actual concrete step of inviting people. The next step, step 4, is actually scheduling a meeting with your leader. And again, we're looking at meeting with bishops here, but you could apply this to meeting with your principal, meeting with the pastor at your own parish. And we give some resources for how to actually do that. The text of maybe an email that you would send, or a strategy for making phone calls and setting up a meeting. Step 5 is you might need to follow up. You might ask for a meeting and not immediately get one or not immediately get a response. Once you've got one, though, once you've got a meeting on the book, step 6 here is beginning to prepare. And Anna's going to talk about this, especially in terms of your narrative and establishing the story that you want to tell to try and persuade the leader that you're meeting with. Step 7 is the meeting encounter. So actually implementing the meeting agenda. We provide an appendix for this, a resource to kind of structure what that might look like. And then step 8 is follow-up. So once you've actually had the meeting, it's a good idea to take some steps to follow up with emails, to send additional resources that you might have talked about in the meeting with your leader. So lots of resources in there. But ultimately, it's kind of as simple and complicated as love and encounter. Those are really the pillars and the bookends of effective advocacy in general, and effective faith-based advocacy that tries to work with both secular and Catholic leaders in the U.S. Catholic Church. So as I said, this is a framework, this is a resource, and one of the most important pieces of this is your story, your narrative. And so I want to turn it back over to Anna to talk about your greatest asset, which is your story.
Thanks, Dan. And I wanted to just add something from my piece earlier when I was talking about, like, what is it about this moment that's so opportune? Just naming too that within the global church right now, there is a 7-year process called the Laudato Si Action platform that really seeks, it's coming from Pope Francis, this invitation to really mobilize the entire US Catholic Church around climate. And that is another thing just to know, like, this is an opportune time for young people to show up with energy behind this, because you've also got the support coming from Pope Francis at the top. It's a really opportune time. So it's important to kind of have a sense of those things too. What are the signs of the times? What are the winds that we can catch in this work? Okay, so as I was introducing Dan, I posed a couple questions for you to consider, and you can see them here again. So I wanna just turn our attention to this second question. What's your why? So put differently, what is your stake in the climate crisis? What does it have to do with you? Why do you care? So Katharine Hayhoe is a climate scientist, and she's a Christian, and she's an expert on talking about climate across political divides. And she has a recent book called Saving Us that's got a lot of really wonderful resources, and I'm gonna draw from it quite a bit in the next few minutes. And in this book, she writes, everyone already has the values they need to care about the future of our world, even if they're not the same as mine or yours. And if they don't think they care, it's because they just haven't connected the dots. When they do, they'll see for themselves that caring about climate change is entirely consistent with who they are. Climate action, in fact, can be an even more genuine expression of their identity and their values than inaction or denial would be. So when I first read this passage, I was like, yes, that. So in my work, I'm often asked, why should people of faith care about climate change? And I like to sort of turn that question on its head and ask, how can we help people of faith to see that they already do care about climate change? And I think this is really true for people of no faith too. I think it's kind of human beings, it's in our best interest and our values generally to care. So as Katharine Hayhoe puts it, to care about climate change, you only need to be one thing, and that's a person living on planet Earth who wants a better future. Chances are you are already that person, and so is everyone else that you know. So how then can we help people to see that they already do care about the climate crisis, or to believe that taking action on the climate crisis is a good use of their time and energy? The answer in part has to do with storytelling, with our sense of our own climate story and our ability to tell it in a way that resonates with the values of the person that we're talking with. Story has the power to reach people at the level of the heart, which is where true transformation happens. And that's why in Laudato Si, Pope Francis says that we need ecological conversion, a change of heart that happens at levels both personal and communal. So now I'm going to give you all just a couple of minutes to reflect on your climate story, borrowing questions from Katharine Hayhoe as a springboard. So as you reflect on these questions, which you can see here on the screen, and I'll drop them in the chat in just a moment, consider how a climate in crisis impacts each of these areas of your life. For example, how's your hometown changed since childhood due to a changing climate? Have you experienced extreme weather where you live? How do you feel when you imagine pursuing your passions and the activities that you love doing in 10 years in the midst of a changing climate, or 20? What does your faith tradition or an important cultural community to which you belong have to say about climate and related issues, such as concern for those on the margins of society? And I just want to invite people to share in the chat what came up for you. So maybe it's where like for me this summer, living in Seattle, I had to have running my air conditioner and my air purifier, both of which were brand new at the same time to deal with wildfire smoke and heat wave happening at the same time. And that's one of the moments climate change became really real to me. Or maybe it's, I grew up in a town that it's hard for me to imagine ever moving back to, because the climate future there feels kind of scarier to me than where I've landed. I've heard that from folks too. So what is your why? I would love to just hear from a couple people in the chat. What's your why for this work? here we go. I want to go to college and grow up normally, but that might not happen if we don't change now. Yeah. And I feel like I could probably, if we were in a room where we could see each other, have some people snapping for that who feel similarly. I'm passionate about photography, especially nature photography, and I can't imagine a world where I can't share my appreciation for nature's beauty with others through photos. Yeah, thank you. That's really powerful. So others might be mid-typing, and feel free to share those. I find, you can listen to Dan and me share our immense wells of wisdom here, but there's so much wisdom that comes from community. So I'd invite you to just use the chat to continue to share those as they come up. And as you begin to get a sense of your stake in the climate crisis, you can also begin to think about how to share your story in ways that will have the greatest impact. What of your story might you emphasize in a conversation with your climate denying uncle? I laugh because I feel like poor uncles just always get a bad rap. They're always the example, right? But what might you emphasize with your theoretical climate denying uncle, or your friend who believes in climate change but doesn't believe that they can make a difference? Your parish priest or your school principal, in an effort to garner their support for a creation care initiative that you want to start? How about a local politician whose support you're seeking for an environmental justice initiative? So the answer to this question is going to have a lot to do with the values of the person that you're talking to and how you can find common ground in those values, right? It's like Catherine Hayhoe was saying, it's in all of our values to support this. It's just a matter of connecting the dots. And you can gain knowledge of this on people through listening, right? So having those encounters through asking some of the questions that you just spent time reflecting on, asking those of other people to learn about what matters to them. Or in the case of leaders who you may not have access to for extended conversations, maybe through research on their public positions and their past actions and their life stories. So one last thought on the topic of storytelling. One of the reasons that we tell our stories is because it's strategic. So research has shown that when we're talking about moral issues, particularly across political divides, sharing personal experiences is more effective than hammering people with facts. And this is all the more true with something like the climate crisis, when I'm sure we can all relate, people can become really defensive and shut down because this is such an enormity of bad news. But we also tell our stories because it's a way that we can begin to create the world that we dream of for ourselves. By clarifying our own stake in the climate crisis and how our actions align with our values, we bolster our own sense of commitment to and our sustainability in the struggle for a habitable and thriving planet for all. And we're helped through this work to become more aligned with our own values and our vocation to embody loving stewardship within creation. And when we share our stories and listen to those of others with humility and curiosity, we contribute to the creation of a culture of encounter, where all are seen and celebrated for the fullness of who they are as inherently and irrevocably beloved co-creators within the gift of the web of life. So at the Covenant, we've pulled together some resources to help you identify and craft your story. Dan and I have both made bit.ly links for the same page that are slightly different. So if you capture the earlier bit.ly link, it'll take you to the same place as this one. So you can access them at bit.ly/ccc_advocacy, along with a recording of a previous webinar during which our Director of Communications, Elena Gauna, explains how you can make use of these resources to help craft a compelling and effective story for use in your advocacy work. And at the same link, you'll find a guide summing up a lot of the skills that Dan covered in his portion of the presentation. It's the one that he had screenshots from. And it also outlines specific steps that you can take to advocate to your church leader on climate in advance of the upcoming COP26. And finally, I hope that you'll consider joining our network of young people working for climate and ecological justice in the Catholic sphere. And you can sign up to receive updates on youth and young adult mobilization at the Covenant on our website at that link, catholicclimatecovenant.org/program/YYA. And with that, we've got some time for some questions. So you are welcome to submit your questions in the chat. You can also raise your hand and you can unmute. We are recording this, so if you come off of mute, then your image and what you say will be on the internet. So if that's overwhelming for you, you might go with the chat instead. Perhaps we can stop screen sharing so we can see each other. All righty. So what questions do people have? Are there specific programs for high schoolers that are part of Catholic Climate Covenant? So we've got some different resources on our resource page for different age groups. Our youth and young adult mobilization effort is actually pretty new. So there's a lot that's still in development and a lot of room for if you are excited and you're interested about climate, to make that known, and we've got shape to really respond to the needs of the people who are showing up. So if you're interested in being a part of that network, you can sign up. I'll drop the link in the chat. It was that the Catholic Climate Covenant /program/YYA, and I'll drop it there. And I would say too, the specific campaign that the materials Dan was referencing, the campaign that was created for is one that I think high schoolers are great people to step into that. So Dan, do you want to say anything more about that?
Yeah, the resource that we created that toolkit for is, again, to support the Catholic Action Letter for institutions. And as just kind of a quick overview, November 1st in Glasgow will open the COP26 UN climate negotiations. So essentially the world's next big chance opportunity to craft an international climate agreement. And so ahead of COP26, what we're doing at the Covenant is inviting Catholic institutions to sign a letter that indicates their support for a science-based and just climate agreement at COP. And so you can see, I'm screen sharing, this is the link on our God's Planet webpage, but you can see other organizations that have signed the letter. But essentially, we're trying to get as many, certainly dioceses and archdioceses, but also parishes, high schools, youth and young adult groups, different organizations within the Catholic Church to step out and publicly affirm their commitment to a science-based and a just climate policy at COP26. So, so this is the resource, and as Anna said, we've got the bit.lys that'll take folks there, but this is the resource. And I think, you know, there's lots of people who are interested in advocacy. There are questions now about the reconciliation process in terms of what's being considered right now in the U.S. Congress, and that's certainly up in the air even in the last 12 hours. But I think the COP26 advocacy is really kind of an overarching opportunity for people to enter into that advocacy space and to do it from a faith-based perspective using this resource.
Thanks, Dan. We have another great question that came through. A few of us here are meeting with Congress members on Monday to advocate for environmental justice. What do you recommend we say to these leaders in our brief explanation of why they should advocate for environmental justice issues? Any thoughts on that, Dan?
Yeah, I think, Anna, like you said, I think it's a matter of, I mean, you could say lots of things. I think strategically, and ISN does such a great job of prepping people for this, I think strategically, it's a matter of identifying what that legislator already cares about and connecting climate to that issue, either politically or personally. So if the member is the legislator is a member of, you know, U.S. Military committees, you might connect climate change to, you know, to national security concerns, or climate change is a threat multiplier that can catalyze violence. But if you know that the legislator has, you know, several grandchildren, or is, you know, a person of faith, maybe the Catholic tradition or another, you can strategically connect climate change to those concerns. So I think it's really kind of a matter of, you could say a lot of different things. It's a question of what's going to be most effective, kind of knowing your audience walking in.